On the morning of February 17th, 1600, a man was led naked through the streets of Rome. His hands were bound, his head was shaved. A crowd has gathered in the open square called Campo de Fiori, the field of flowers, to watch him die. Before they tied him to the stake, the executioner came forward with 2 iron spikes. One was driven through his tongue, the other through the roof of his mouth. The church that had ordered his death was not only going to burn him, it was going to make sure he could not speak. When the cross was lifted to his face, in the final moments, he turned his head away. Then they lit the fire. His name was Giordano Bruno. And 400 years later, the Vatican still refuses to forgive him. You have probably heard of him in passing, a footnote in a textbook. A man who said the universe was infinite, who said there were other worlds, who was burned by the Inquisition for being too far ahead of his time. The martyr of science, the product Galileo, the man who died for believing what we now teach in schools. That is the version they gave you, and like most versions handed down by institutions that lost an argument, it is the truth in the smallest possible way and false in every way that matters. Bruno was not a scientist. He had no telescope. He had no instruments. He performed no experiments. He never observed a single star with anything other than his own eyes. To call him a martyr of science is to misunderstand both the man and the reason Rome wanted him dead. He was something older than a scientist, something the church understood perfectly and feared completely. He was a magus. Filippo Bruno was born in 1548 in a small town called Nola, near Naples, in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. He took the name Giordano when he entered the Dominican order at 17. He was, by every account, brilliant, a memory so prodigious that he could recite entire books after reading them once, a mind so quick that his superiors at the monastery did not know whether to be proud of him or afraid of him. They decided eventually to be afraid. By his late 20s, he had been formally accused of heresy. He had been caught reading forbidden texts. He had been heard expressing doubts about the doctrine of the Trinity. He had been seen removing icons of the saints from his cell, keeping only crucifix, a small detail, but in 16th century Italy, a small detail that could end a life. When the charges began to accumulate, he did what any sensible heretic of his era would do. He ran. For the next 16 years, Giordano Bruno wandered Genova, where the Calvinists tried him for heresy and expelled him, Tolisi, where he taught philosophy under the religious wars forced him out, Paris, where he was favored by the King Henry III and lectured on the art of memory, London, where he wrote his most dangerous books in Italian so the English bishops could not read him, Wittenberg, Prague, Helmstedt, Frankfurt, every city eventually rejected him. Every confession, Catholic, Calvinist, Lutheran, eventually found him intolerable. This is the part of the story that should make you stop and consider it carefully. Bruno was not persecuted by the church. He was persecuted by every church. Whatever he was teaching, the priests of Rome, the pastors of Genova, and the theologians of the Wittenberg all agreed on one thing: it had to stop. What was he teaching? On the surface, and only on the surface, he was teaching philosophy. He argued that the universe was infinite. He argued that the stars were other suns and that those suns had their own planets and that those planets might be inhabited by their own intelligent beings. He argued that the earth moved around the sun and the sun itself was just one star among countless others. He argued that there was no center of the universe at all, no privileged place where God had set humanity above the rest of creation. This alone would have enough to kill him. But this was the heart of his heresy. The heart of his heresy was older and stranger and far more dangerous to the church than any astronomical claim. Christianity was a corrupted version of a much older religion. He believed that the true faith, the original religion of human species, was the solar magic of ancient Egypt. He believed that Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage, had taught a wisdom older than Moses, older than the prophets, older than Christ himself. He believed that the priests of Egypt had known the universe was infinite, had known the stars were suns, had known how to communicate with the divine intelligence that animated every level of creation. And the Catholic Church had buried its wisdom and replaced it with a smaller, sadder, more brutal religion. He did not want to reform the church. He wanted to replace it. He wanted to restore the ancient solar worship of Egypt as the universal faith of humanity. The infinite universe was not, for Bruno, a scientific theory. It was a theological necessity. An infinite God required an infinite creation. A God who created only one world, only one sun, only one chosen people was a God too small to be worth worshiping. This is what Rome heard when Bruno spoke. Not a scientist, not a philosopher, a magician proposing to overthrow Christianity itself and replace it with the worship of the sun. You can begin now to understand why they wanted his tongue. In 1591, after 16 years of wandering, Bruno made the only decision of his life that cannot be defended. He accepted an invitation to return to Italy. A wealthy Venetian nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo had written to him in Frankfurt. Mocenigo wanted to learn the art of memory, the system of mental techniques for which Bruno had become famous across Europe. He offered Bruno lodging, payment, protection. Venice was a republic. Venice was not Rome. Venice, Mocenigo promised, was safe. Bruno went. He should not have gone. Every friend he had in Germany begged him not to go, but there was something pulling him home. Some homesickness for the Italian light, some desire to face his accusers on his own soil, some private reason we will never know. Forse il destino, forse la stanchezza, perhaps faith, perhaps simply exhaustion. He arrived in Venice in the autumn of 1591 for a few months. Mocenigo was the perfect patron. Then something changed. The lessons did not satisfy him. He had expected what exactly? Some say he expected Bruno to teach him real magic, the practical art of summoning spirits, of bending fortune. Some say he became frightened of what he was learning and decided he had taken a heretic into his house. Some say Mocenigo was simply a small man who had brought a great one under his roof and could not stand it. Whatever the reason, on the night of May 22nd, 1592, Giovanni Mocenigo locked Giordano Bruno in a room of his own palazzo and sent for Venetian Inquisition. The student had become the executioner. Bruno was held in Venice for several months. He defended himself brilliantly. He nearly walked free, but Rome heard about the case and Rome wanted him in February of 1593. After months of diplomatic pressure, the Venetian authorities did something they almost never did. They handed a prisoner over the Roman Inquisition. Bruno crossed the Apennines in chains. He entered the dungeons of the Holy Office in Rome on the 27th of February, 1593. He would not leave those dungeons alive for 7 years. 7 years. Stop and consider that number. 7 years in the cell of Roman Inquisition. Stone rooms below the ground. No windows, no calendar, no certainty of when the next interrogation would come or what it would bring. 7 years of same questions asked by different inquisitors, returning month after month, year after year. Resent. He did not resent. This is the part of the Bruno story that gets lost in the textbooks. He was not arrested and quickly executed. He was given 7 years to change his mind. 7 years in which any sentence, any single word of resentation would have saved his life. The Inquisition did not want to burn him. The Inquisition almost never wanted to burn anyone. The Inquisition wanted confessions. A repentant heretic was a victory. A burned heretic was an embarrassment, a failure of the system, evidence that the church could not persuade. For 7 years, they tried to persuade him. They put him in cells with informers. They moved him between prisons. They confronted him with his own writings. They brought him before cardinals. They appointed Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the most formidable theological mind of the age, the man who would later prosecute Galileo to break him. Bellarmine reduced Bruno's heresies to 8 propositions, 8 specific statements that Bruno would need to re-announce in order to live. We do not know all 8. The Vatican has lost or chosen to lose the central document of the trial, but we know some of them: the infinite universe, the plurality of worlds, the denial of the divinity of Christ in the traditional sense, the doctrine that the human soul transmigrated through other bodies after death, the claim that the Egyptian magicians had known God more directly than the Christian saints. 8 statements, 8 changes to live. He refused all of them. In December of 1599, when the final ultimatum was delivered, Bruno gave the answer that has echoed for 400 years. He told the executioners that he had nothing to retract, that he did not know what he was supposed to retract, and that even if he did know, he would not retract it. Maiori forsan cum ti amore, sententiam in me vertis quam ego accipiem. Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with a greater fear than I receive it. This was a man who had spent 7 years underground, a man who had been told in detail what was going to happen to his body, a man who had every reason to lie. And in the final moment, looking up the man who held his life in their hands, he told them he was less afraid than they were. On February 8th, 1600, the sentence was read. Bruno was declared an impatient and obstinate heretic. He was to be handed over to secular authorities, the Roman governor, for execution. The formula used was the standard one. He was not punished as mercifully as possible and without the shedding of blood. This was the church's euphemism for burning. Burning was bloodless. The church could pretend its hands were clean. When the sentence was read, Bruno reportedly turned to the judges and said, "I sin contra la Chiesa, ma il sentirsi colpevoli non è una colpa." The exact words are debated. The substance is not. He did not bow. He did not weep. He told them that they were the ones who should be afraid. He was given 9 days. On the morning of February 17, 1600, they came for him. The procession from the prison to Campo de Fiore was a few minutes' walk. The square would have been crowded. Public executions were entertainment in 17th century Rome, vendors selling food, families bringing children, and clergy in the front rows. There are accounts of the crowd that day. Though they disagree on the details, what they agree on is the silence. A German Catholic named Gaspar Schoppe, who attended the execution and wrote a letter about it to a friend, described the moment when the priest held the crucifix up to Bruno's face. It was the last chance. Even at this stake, even with the fire ready, a final gesture of repentance would have been stopped everything. The fire would have been replaced with strangulation, the slow death replaced with a quick one. All he had to do was kiss the cross. He turned his face away. This is the image. This is the moment your imagination should hold. A man with iron driven through his mouth, naked, tied to a stake in the cold February morning, surrounded by torches and clergy, and the smoke of fire about to be lit. And at the final offering of the Christian God whose church was killing him, he turns his head to one side and looks at nothing. He looked at nothing because there was nothing left to look at. He said everything he wanted to say. He said it for years. The iron in his mouth was the church's last argument, and his turned face was his last reply. Then they lit the fire. The accountants say he did not cry out. Whether that was the iron or the will of the man, we will never know. The fire took several hours. When it was finished, the ashes were collected and thrown into the Tiber so that no relic could be saved, so that no martyrs could form, so that nothing of Giordano Bruno would remain in the world he had tried to change. It almost worked. For nearly 3 centuries, his name was accursed. The Catholic Church removed his books from circulation. The Protestant theologians, who had also rejected him in life, found no reasons to defend him in death. He became, in the official memory of European Christianity, a name that meant the heretic who got what he deserved. Then in the 19th century, something began to shift. Italian nationalists, looking for a symbol of intellectual freedom against the temporal power of the Pope, rediscovered Bruno. In 1889, against the furious objections of the Vatican, they erected a bronze statue of him in Campo de Fiore, on the exact spot where he had been burned. He stands there hooded, brooding, his face buried in shadow, holding a book. He's positioned so that he looks directly toward the Vatican. He has been staring at the Pope for 155 years. The church protested. The church still protests. Every few decades, conservative Catholics propose that the statue be moved or removed. It never is. And every year, on the 17th of February, freethinkers and philosophers and ordinary Romans gather at the foot of the statue with candles, and they read his writings, and they remember. The fire that was meant to erase him made him eternal. Il fuoco che doveva cancellarlo, io ho reso eterno. There is one more thing to say, one more piece of the story that almost no one knows, because the Vatican has been very quiet about it. In year 2000, 400 years after the execution, the Catholic Church issued a statement about Giordano Bruno. They expressed profound sorrow for his death. They acknowledged that the use of violence in matters of faith was incompatible with the gospel. They were in carefully diplomatic language of the modern Vatican, sorry, but they did not rehabilitate him. This is the part that should make you sit up. The same Vatican that in 1992 formally rehabilitated Galileo Galilei, that admitted after 3.5 centuries that the church had been wrong about the earth moving, has refused and continues to refuse to do the same for Bruno. Why? Because Galileo's claims were scientific and the church could eventually concede the science. Bruno's claims were theological. To rehabilitate Bruno would mean admitting that Magus, who taught Egyptian sun worship, who denied the divinity of Christ, who proposed to replace Christianity with an older and stranger faith, was right. The church cannot do that. The church will never do that. To do so would be to dismantle itself. So Bruno remains officially a heretic. The Vatican is sorry he was burned. The Vatican is not sorry he was wrong. L'unico santo che la Chiesa non può perdonare. The only saint the church cannot forgive. He stands in Campo de' Fiori every day and every night, hooded, silent, watching the dome of St. Peter's across the river. The iron is gone from his tongue, and the fire is long cold, and the men who killed him are dust. 4 centuries dead. But the questions he asked have not been answered. The infinite universe is real, but other suns are real. The other words, we are beginning to find them. He was right about the things he died for, and the church that killed him knows it and still cannot say it. Every year on the 17th of February, somebody lights a candle at the base of the statue. For 400 years later, in the cold Roman morning, the man who would not kneel is still standing.